It started off as a regular Thursday night. We'd been married for 7 years, together for almost a decade, and I thought I knew my wife better than anyone. But lately, something felt off. Lila had been distant for months, almost as if she'd mentally checked out of our relationship. I put it down to stress. She'd started a new job about a year back, and while it was a great opportunity for her, it demanded long hours and frequent travel. At least, that's what she said. We were in the middle of dinner that night, talking about mundane things, when she dropped it on me out of nowhere. "I think we need some space," she said, staring down at her plate. I remember feeling like the rug had just been pulled out from under me. "Space?" I echoed, genuinely stunned. "Where's this coming from, Lila? I thought we were doing fine." Lila sighed, her shoulders slumping as she explained, "I don't know, Dan. I just feel disconnected. I need time to figure things out for myself. It's not you, it's me." The classic line, right? But I wasn't about to argue. I loved her, and if this was what she needed, I wanted to respect that. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and hurt. I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. I'd see her packing things into suitcases and duffel bags every few days, claiming she was staying with a friend or going on a work retreat. Yet whenever I'd ask for specifics, she'd brush me off, claiming it was too personal or saying she'd explain everything when she was ready. It was disorienting, to say the least. I wanted to believe her, but the little things kept adding up. Lila started coming home less and less, spending days and sometimes even entire weekends away. When I'd bring it up, she'd insist it was just time for herself, that she needed a break from the pressures of marriage to rediscover who she was. I tried to be understanding, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. The woman I thought I knew was slipping away, and every attempt to hold on to her felt like grasping at smoke. One night, about a month into this so-called break, she came home around midnight, looking completely worn out. She was distant, barely even greeting me before heading straight for the shower. As I lay there, listening to the water run, I couldn't ignore the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. Her behavior had gone from distant to almost evasive. The woman who used to share everything with me now had walls I couldn't break through. I started doubting myself, questioning if I was overreacting, but then, little things started to surface. One night, I noticed a few missed calls on her phone from a name I didn't recognize. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off as a work friend and quickly deleted the call history, laughing it off like it was no big deal. But the doubt had taken root. 2 weeks later, I came home early, hoping to surprise her and maybe reconnect. I'd brought her favorite takeout, thinking a quiet night together might help us bridge this distance. But when I got there, the house was empty. I texted her, only to get a vague reply, "Out with a friend." "Don't wait up." That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing her with someone else, wondering if this friend was more than she let on. But I told myself I was just paranoid, that she'd never do something like that. She'd asked for space, and I had to trust her, right? Then, about 3 months into the separation, I was out grabbing a coffee with a mutual friend of ours, Sam. He worked near Lila's office and had known us for years. We got to chatting about how things had been going, and he gave me this strange look. "She's been really happy lately," he said, cautiously. "I saw her out with someone last week. Just figured you guys were trying something new." "Out with someone?" I asked, feeling my heart sink. He went on to explain that he'd seen Lila at a downtown restaurant with a guy he didn't recognize. They seemed pretty close, laughing, touching hands, definitely not the kind of behavior I'd expect from her with just any friend. That was all it took. The doubts I'd been pushing aside finally erupted into full-blown suspicion. I decided to confront her, to ask her point-blank if there was something going on. But every time I tried, she'd just deflect or tell me that I was making things harder than they needed to be. It felt like I was banging my head against a wall, being kept in the dark while she drifted further and further away. I reached a breaking point. One night, after another tense conversation that went nowhere, I made up my mind to find out what was really going on. I wasn't proud of it, but I decided to follow her the next time she left, just to put my mind at ease. I told myself that I was only doing this to settle my suspicions, to prove to myself that I was being paranoid. But a part of me feared that I already knew what I was going to find. The following Friday, she told me she was heading out for a weekend with the girls. As soon as she left, I grabbed my car keys and followed her at a safe distance, watching as she drove out of our neighborhood. I felt like a criminal, my heart pounding as I tailed her car. A part of me still hoped she'd end up at her friend's place, that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But when she pulled into the parking lot of a small hotel on the other side of town, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I watched from a distance as she parked, then waited in her car for a few minutes. She seemed to be checking her phone, maybe texting someone, and a moment later, a man came out from the hotel lobby and waved to her. I felt like I was in a nightmare as I watched her get out of the car, laughing as she ran up to him and wrapped her arms around him in a way that was far too intimate for just a friend. They headed inside, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching. I sat there in my car, unable to process what I'd just seen. My mind was racing, torn between anger, disbelief, and this crushing sadness that made it hard to breathe. I felt like a fool. I had been holding on to the hope that she just needed some time alone, that we could work things out, but here she was, living a life I knew nothing about. After sitting in the parking lot for what felt like hours, I finally drove home. I didn't know what to do or what to say. I felt betrayed, but I also felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. Every time she had told me she needed space or time to herself, it had been a lie. She hadn't needed space, she'd needed freedom to live this other life, to be with someone else without facing any consequences. Over the next few days, I tried to act normal around her, even though the image of her with that man was seared into my mind. She'd come home late on Sunday night, pretending like everything was fine. She even asked me how my weekend was, as if we were just two people catching up after a few days apart. I didn't confront her, though. I wasn't ready. I needed more than just a glimpse from across a parking lot to justify ending things, to face her and tell her that I knew. So, I started paying closer attention, noticing every little thing she'd do or say that didn't add up. I saw the way she'd take her phone with her wherever she went, even to the bathroom, as if she was terrified I might see something. I noticed how she'd get defensive whenever I asked where she'd been, or why she'd been coming home so late. But what really got me was how effortlessly she'd lie to my face, how calm and composed she seemed, like she'd done this so many times that it was second nature to her. The following weekend, she told me she'd be out with the girls again, but this time, I decided to dig a little deeper. I went through our shared bank statements and credit card history. Sure enough, there were multiple charges at restaurants and hotels in the past few months, all from nights when she'd supposedly been at a work retreat or spending time with friends. Each charge felt like another betrayal, another layer of the life she'd been hiding from me. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, I stumbled upon a message on her iPad, one she hadn't deleted yet. It was from him, the same guy I'd seen her with. His name was Greg, and the message was loaded with pet names, plans for future weekends, and even a few inside jokes. They were laughing at me. They were making plans right under my nose, carrying on like I didn't exist. I was furious, but I knew I had to keep it together. I needed to confront her, but not in a way that would let her twist things or lie her way out. I'd been quiet and understanding for too long, and now it was time to take control of the situation. That night, I waited up for her, sitting at the dining table with her iPad open, the messages from Greg clearly displayed on the screen. When she walked in, she looked startled to see me awake, and I could tell from her face that she knew something was wrong. "Have a good night?" I asked, my voice calm. She stammered, trying to make excuses, but I just held up the iPad, the evidence right there in black and white. The color drained from her face when she saw the messages. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. For once, she had no quick excuse, no clever lie. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that her secret life was unraveling right in front of her. "Who is he, Lila?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. "How long has this been going on?" She looked down, refusing to meet my gaze. It's complicated, Dan," she muttered, as if that would somehow excuse the months of deceit. I don't know, I needed something different. Something that made me feel alive. Her words cut deeper than I expected. She didn't apologize, didn't show any remorse, just offered some vague justification that sounded like something straight out of a bad romance novel. I couldn't believe she thought needing something different was a reason to betray me, to tear apart everything we'd built together. "You needed something different? So you just decided to live a double life? Did you ever think about what this would do to me?" I asked, feeling anger rise to the surface. I'd given her everything: trust, love, understanding, space, and she'd taken it all for granted. Finally, she met my eyes, and I saw something that almost looked like defiance. "Dan, we got married so young. I never had a chance to experience anything outside of us. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but I needed to see who I was on my own." "On your own?" I repeated, stunned. "You've been finding yourself by sneaking around with another man behind my back for months. You call that being on your own?" The anger I'd been holding back poured out. "Why didn't you just talk to me, Lila? We could have worked through it. You didn't need to break us like this." She looked away, and I could see that my words weren't landing the way I'd hoped. Instead of guilt or regret, I saw frustration, like she was more annoyed than sorry. "I didn't want to drag you into my issues, Dan," she said coldly. "I thought I could handle it on my own." It was like talking to a stranger. The woman I'd known for a decade had been replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. The worst part? She was acting like I was the one making a big deal out of this, like I was somehow overreacting to the fact that my wife had been living a double life. "Just tell me the truth, Lila," I said, my voice breaking despite my attempts to stay calm. "How long has this been going on? And why, if you were so unhappy, didn't you just leave?" She sighed, still avoiding eye contact, and muttered, "It's been about 6 months, maybe a bit longer." She shrugged like she was talking about a minor inconvenience, not a massive betrayal. "And I didn't leave because, well, it's not like I don't care about you, Dan. I just needed something more. Greg was just a way to fill a part of me that you can't. I never wanted to hurt you." At that moment, something inside me snapped. She'd made a conscious choice, over and over, to keep this hidden from me, to lie to my face every time she'd walked out that door. She'd looked me in the eye, claimed she was taking time for herself, and all the while, she'd been with him, filling some void she thought I couldn't fill. "So, what now?" I asked, my voice cold. "Are you just going to keep seeing him? Or am I supposed to wait here while you figure out which part of you I'm not enough for?" She flinched, finally showing some real emotion, though I couldn't tell if it was guilt or anger. "I don't know, Dan. I don't know what I want. This isn't as simple as you're making it out to be." She looked at me as if I was being unreasonable, as if I should just accept her confusion and give her more time to figure out her life. But I'd already given her enough time. Months, in fact, without realizing it. Months where I'd been the patient, supportive husband, holding down the fort while she found herself. And all the while, she'd been using that time to live a life that had no place for me. I stood up, feeling the weight of my anger and hurt, and said, "If you don't know what you want, maybe it's time I decide what I want. And I sure as hell don't want to keep being the guy you come back to when you're done finding yourself." She looked up at me, startled, and I saw a flicker of fear cross her face. "Dan, please, don't make any rash decisions. We can work through this. But I shook my head. You already made the decision, Lila. You chose this. You chose him. Without another word, I left the room, feeling like the house was suffocating me. I needed air, distance, anything to escape the toxic atmosphere that had taken over our home. I ended up at Mark's place, my best friend. When he opened the door, he took one look at me and didn't even ask questions. We sat in silence for a long time before I finally told him everything. The whole messed up story spilled out of me, and he listened without interrupting, just letting me get it all out. When I was done, he shook his head. I don't know what to say, man. That's brutal. He paused, then added, you deserve better than this. I knew he was right, but it didn't make it hurt any less. After that night, things changed. I didn't feel like I could just sit around and wait for her to make up her mind. Lila tried reaching out, texting me, leaving messages, saying we needed to talk. But I ignored every single one. I needed time to process what had happened, to think about what I wanted from my life without the weight of her confusion dragging me down. It was clear she wasn't thinking about us, she was thinking about herself. A few days later, I got a message from Greg. Somehow, he'd gotten my number. I remember staring at the message in disbelief. He'd written this half apology, saying he never intended to cause harm, and that he didn't know Lila was married at first. It was full of excuses, attempts to make himself look like the victim of the situation. It was like he thought that saying sorry over text would make up for the wreckage he'd helped create. I was about to delete the message and block his number when I got a call from Lila. This time, I decided to answer. Why is Greg texting me? I demanded, skipping any kind of greeting. What's he doing with my number? There was silence on her end before she finally muttered, I didn't give him your number. I don't know how he got it. Look, Dan, I know things are a mess right now, but I still care about you, and I want to talk things through. We owe it to ourselves to have a real conversation. Owe it to ourselves? I said, nearly laughing at the absurdity. Lila, you've spent the last 6 months lying to me, and now you want to have an honest conversation? Now. She hesitated, then said, I made mistakes, but we've built a life together. I didn't plan any of this, it just happened. I clenched my fist, anger surging through me again at her choice of words. Stop saying it just happened, Lila. You didn't trip and fall into a double life. This was a choice you made, over and over. You lied, you covered it up, and now you want me to believe it was just some accident? Her tone shifted from apologetic to defensive. I was feeling lost, Dan. I needed something, and you weren't there. You were always working, always focused on everything but me. And Greg, he was just there when I needed someone. So this is my fault now? I shot back, incredulous. I was the one working, supporting us, building our future, while you were out sneaking around behind my back. And you want me to believe it's because I didn't pay you enough attention? Her voice softened, turning to a desperate plea. Dan, please, let's just meet in person and talk this through. I know I messed up, but there's more to this than you realize. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. Part of me hoped that maybe, somehow, there was an explanation that would make this hurt less. Maybe she'd say something that would make the betrayal feel less like a punch to the gut. We arranged to meet at a park near our house, somewhere public where I could walk away if things got too heated. When I got there, she was already sitting on a bench, looking nervous and uncertain, a far cry from the confident, defiant woman I'd confronted with her messages. I sat down, keeping a careful distance, and waited for her to start. For a moment it was just awkward silence, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, she broke the silence. Dan, I know you're hurt, and I know I can't take back what I did. But I still love you. I lost myself for a while. Greg was a mistake, a distraction. I thought he was filling something I was missing, but he's not you. He never was. I didn't say anything, just watched her as she spoke. She looked down, twisting her hands, struggling to find the right words. I was lonely, Dan. And it was like, I don't know, like I was watching someone else make these choices. I know it sounds crazy, but it felt like I was outside myself, just going through the motions. So what? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Now that you've had your fun, you're ready to come back and pretend like nothing happened? No, she insisted, a hint of panic in her eyes. It's not like that. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I just want a chance to rebuild what we had. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Her words should have meant something, but all I felt was emptiness. She sounded sincere, maybe even a little broken, but I'd seen too much, been hurt too deeply. The trust was gone, and no amount of begging was going to restore it. Do you even understand what you've done? I asked quietly. You took everything we built together, every promise we made, and you threw it away. And for what? For someone who, in your own words, isn't me. How am I supposed to trust you again? She didn't answer, just looked away, tears filling her eyes. I don't have a good answer, Dan. I just know that I was wrong, and that I'm willing to do anything to make this right. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us lost in our thoughts. I could see she was hurting, and maybe a part of me even wanted to believe her. But then I remembered the months of lies, the times she'd walked out that door with a smile, claiming she was finding herself, while she was actually with him. Finally, I stood up. I can't do this, Lila. You say you love me, but love isn't what you've shown me these past 6 months. Love doesn't lie, and it doesn't turn its back on the people who trust it. She reached out as if to grab my hand, but I pulled back. Dan, please, don't leave me. We can go to counseling, start fresh. I'll prove it to you. But I'd made up my mind. The pain she'd caused wasn't something I could just put a band-aid on. She had shattered us, and no amount of counseling or promises could undo that. I walked away from her that day, feeling the finality of it settle over me. She kept calling out my name, her voice breaking, but I didn't turn back. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I knew it was the right decision. I couldn't keep holding on to a marriage that she'd already destroyed with her betrayal. The woman I thought I'd known for so long was gone, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for the sake of finding herself. When I got home, I found myself staring at the empty spaces she'd left in our house, her side of the closet, the half-full shelf in the bathroom, even the spot on the couch where she'd always sat. The life we'd built together had been so intertwined, and it was painful to imagine it all coming undone. But that's the thing about betrayal, it tears through everything, leaving nothing intact. In the days that followed, she sent message after message, begging me to reconsider. She told me she'd do anything, that she was willing to go to therapy, to cut off all contact with Greg, to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. But every message only made me angrier. The audacity of asking for forgiveness after months of deceit felt like a slap in the face. I ignored every one, knowing I needed the distance if I was ever going to get past this. One night, about a week after our meeting at the park, she showed up at my door. I didn't know she was coming, and when I opened the door to find her standing there, looking disheveled and exhausted, I felt a mix of pity and frustration. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes, clutching a small bag in her hand as if she'd come prepared to stay. Dan, please. I know you hate me right now, but just hear me out. Just one last time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I almost closed the door on her, but against my better judgment, I stepped back and let her in. She looked around the house, her gaze lingering on the little pieces of our life that were still scattered everywhere, then sat down on the couch, wringing her hands. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? I asked, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. She nodded, looking down, tears starting to roll down her cheeks. I do, Dan. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand why this happened. I felt like I was losing myself, like our life was just swallowing me whole. I never wanted to hurt you. You never wanted to hurt me. I scoffed, shaking my head. Lila, you didn't just hurt me. You lied to me, manipulated me, and for what? Some need to find yourself. Why couldn't you come to me? Why did you have to tear our marriage apart? She was silent for a long time before she finally spoke. Because I was scared. Scared you'd never understand, that you'd think I was weak or selfish. And maybe I am. But I never stopped loving you, Dan. I got lost. I wanted to believe her, to tell myself that she was just a broken person who'd made a mistake. But the truth was, her choices had been deliberate. She'd chosen, time and time again, to keep me in the dark, to lead this double life that I'd only discovered by accident. So now what? I asked, exhaustion weighing down my voice. Do you want me to just pretend this never happened? Do you want to come back, as if nothing's changed? She shook her head. I don't expect things to go back to normal. I know I have to earn your trust again, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut off everyone who was part of this. I'll even quit my job if that's what you need. Just, please, don't throw everything away because of one mistake. One mistake? I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. Lila, this wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose him, over and over. You chose to lie to me, every time you walked out that door. How am I supposed to just overlook that? She was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking. I don't know, Dan. I don't know how to fix this. All I know is that I love you, and I don't want to lose you. Please, give me one last chance. For a moment, I considered it. A small, hopeful part of me wanted to believe that we could rebuild, that maybe, with time, things could go back to the way they were. But then I remembered the pain, the months of deception, and the life she'd built behind my back. It was like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, and I didn't know if I could live with it. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice breaking. You didn't just cheat on me, Lila. You shattered everything we had. Every memory, every promise, it's all tainted now. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She reached out, as if to touch me, but I pulled away, the distance between us feeling like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. I'm sorry, Lila, I said, barely able to get the words out. I can't do this. I don't think there's anything left to save. She sat there, stunned, as the reality of my words sank in. I could see the devastation on her face, the regret and the sadness, but I felt strangely numb. Maybe I'd finally reached my limit, the point where the pain had burned itself out and left only a dull ache behind. She got up slowly, looking like she was about to say something, but then she just nodded, wiping away her tears as she headed for the door. She paused, looking back at me one last time, but I didn't meet her gaze. I couldn't. And then, just like that, she was gone. As the door closed behind her, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. It was over. The marriage I'd once treasured was gone, dissolved in the lies and betrayal that had poisoned it beyond repair. I knew the coming days would be painful, that I'd have to confront the emptiness she'd left behind, but at least now, I was free to start again, to rebuild my life on my own terms. The days after she left were brutal. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the life we'd shared, the photos on the walls, the little notes she used to leave on the fridge, her coffee mug still sitting in the cupboard. I thought about throwing everything out, about erasing every trace of her from my life, but somehow, I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt too final, too much like tearing apart the life I'd built and facing that hollow, lonely reality on my own. Friends reached out, and I finally opened up to them, sharing what had happened. Their reactions varied, from anger on my behalf to stunned disbelief. Some of them had known Lila for years, and they were just as blindsided as I was by her betrayal. They offered support, invited me out, even tried to make me laugh, but it felt like there was a wall between me and everyone else. I could go through the motions, but the hurt was still there, raw and constant. Then, one evening, I got a text from her. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. It was simple, almost painfully so: "I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day you can forgive me. I'll always love you." I stared at those words, feeling a surge of anger mixed with something I couldn't quite define. Forgiveness? After everything she'd done, after the lies, the betrayal, the manipulation, she still had the audacity to ask for my forgiveness? But at the same time, I knew I couldn't carry that anger with me forever. I needed to let it go, to find peace on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work and into projects I'd always put off. I took up running, partly to clear my mind and partly to have something to focus on besides the emptiness. I also started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me unpack everything, help me understand why this betrayal had shattered me so completely. In therapy, I realized that it wasn't just Lila's affair that had hurt me. It was the years of trust I'd invested in her, the vulnerability I'd shown, the way I'd let her into every part of my life, only to have her turn around and betray it all. I'd built my world around her, and when she pulled that world apart, it felt like I'd lost myself in the process. My therapist helped me see that I wasn't defined by her actions, that the love and trust I'd given weren't wasted. They were part of who I was, and just because she had taken advantage of them didn't make them any less valuable. Slowly, I started to rebuild my self-worth, to understand that her choices didn't reflect on me but on her own insecurities, her own failures. Months went by, and the hurt began to fade. I still had days where the pain crept back in, where I'd wonder if there was something I could have done differently. But those days were fewer and farther between. Instead, I started looking forward, thinking about what I wanted from my life, about the kind of future I could build on my own. I ran into her once, at a grocery store of all places. She looked different, older, maybe, or maybe it was just the weight of everything that had happened between us. We both paused, uncertain, a mix of emotions passing between us. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. I could see the regret in her eyes, the sadness, but I didn't feel the same anger I once had. She gave me a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement, and I returned it. We didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. And with that, I walked away, feeling lighter than I had in months. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a moment, thinking about how far I'd come. I'd spent so long feeling broken, feeling like I'd never recover from what she'd done. But in that moment, I realized I'd finally found peace. I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up, and I was stronger for it. Now, as I write this, I don't feel the bitterness I once did. I don't feel the anger, the betrayal, or the heartbreak. I feel free. I can look back on our relationship and remember the good parts without letting the bad consume me. I've learned to love myself again, to trust myself, and to look forward to a future where I am enough, all on my own. And maybe that's the greatest victory of all.